The advertisement had been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper had gone soft along the creases, nearly worn through in two places where his thumb had pressed without thinking. Cole Hargrove stood at the edge of the eastern pasture in the gray hour before sunrise, the kind of morning that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. The grass was still wet. The sky was the color of ash. He held the small square of newsprint between two fingers, the way a man holds something he is not sure he should keep, and he read it again, though he had already memorized every word. He had written it in one sitting, at the kitchen table, after Owen had gone to bed. 8 sentences. He had crossed out 15 before settling on 8. Ruth had stood in the doorway, watching him without comment, which was how she communicated most things she felt strongly about. When he slid the paper across the table toward her, she read it, set it back down, and said nothing for long enough that he thought she had decided against speaking at all. Then she said, "Send it." That was all. He sent it the next morning before he could change his mind. That had been 3 weeks ago. He had not told Owen. He had not told anyone in Greystone, which was a small enough town that not telling people required a specific kind of effort. He had gone about his days the way he always did, up before dawn, coffee standing at the window, work until his body had nothing left to argue with, sleep that came from exhaustion rather than peace. And somewhere in the middle of those days, a letter had arrived from a woman named Wren Calloway, written in handwriting that was small and precise, and took up every inch of the page as though she was unwilling to waste any of it. He had read her letter 4 times. He had written back the same night. Now he stood in the wet grass with the advertisement in his hand, and somewhere behind him, the ranch house was waking up. He could hear the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard on the left side of the hallway, which meant Owen was already up, moving quietly the way he had moved since his mother died, as though the house required careful handling. Cole folded the paper one more time and put it back in his shirt pocket. He stood there a moment longer, looking out at the flat stretch of land that ran east until it dissolved into the low hills. Broken Spur had been in his family for 2 generations. His father had worked this land, and his father's father before that, and neither of them had ever needed to place an advertisement in a newspaper to hold on to it. Cole was aware of this. He was aware of it the way a man is aware of a splinter he has decided not to remove yet, persistently, quietly, in the background of everything else. He turned and walked back toward the house. Ruth was already in the kitchen when he came through the door, a small woman in her 60s who had worked at Broken Spur since before Owen was born. She moved through the kitchen with the authority of someone who had earned her familiarity with every shelf and cabinet, and she had the particular quality of silence that made rooms feel inhabited rather than empty. She set a cup of coffee on the table without looking up. Cole sat down and wrapped his hands around it. "She wrote again," Ruth said, not a question. "She arrives today." Ruth turned from the stove. She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at Owen, assessing, careful, deciding how much to say. "Does Owen know?" "Not yet." Ruth turned back to the stove. The silence stretched out comfortable and honest between them. After a moment she said, "He'll have questions." "I know. He'll have feelings he doesn't have words for." "I know that too." Cole drank his coffee. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and the particular warmth of a room that had been heating up since before daylight, and he thought, not for the first time, that this was the thing he was most afraid of losing. Not the land itself, not the cattle or the fences or the years of work, but this specific quality of morning. This room. The sound of Owen's footsteps on the stairs. The hearing had lasted 40 minutes. Cole had sat across a narrow table from a man in a gray coat who read from a document in a voice that suggested he had read from many such documents and found none of them particularly interesting, and the words had arranged themselves into a verdict that Cole was still not entirely used to hearing. One man, living alone, no woman in the house, no evidence of a stable domestic environment for a child of this age. The grandmother, Nora Whitmore, had filed the petition. She was not a cruel woman. Cole had known her for years, and he understood that she believed what she was saying, that she looked at Broken Spur and saw isolation and hard winters, and a man who worked from dawn to dark and came to the table with soil under his fingernails and not much conversation. She looked at Owen and saw a boy who needed more than that. Cole could not explain to her, or to the man in the gray coat, or to anyone in that room, what Owen had done the morning after his mother's funeral, when he came downstairs before daylight and found his father already in the kitchen and sat down across from him and said nothing. And the two of them had sat together in the dark for an hour without speaking. And it had been enough. Cole could not explain that this was its own language, that some things between a father and a son did not require translation. He could not explain that Owen had inherited his mother's capacity for a certain kind of silence, the kind that was not absence, but presence, the kind that asked nothing and offered everything, and that sitting across from his son in the dark kitchen on the morning after the worst day of his life, Cole had understood that they were going to be all right. Not immediately, not without cost, but eventually, in the way that living things that intend to survive eventually find their way toward the conditions that allow it. But 60 days. He had 60 days to demonstrate, in terms that a hearing could understand, that this was a home. He heard Owen on the stairs and straightened slightly in his chair. The boy came into the kitchen in the careful way he had, not timid exactly, but considered as though he calculated the weight of entering a room before he did it. He was 9 years old and tall for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and the particular watchfulness of a child who had learned early that the world contained surprises that were not always good ones. He sat down at the table in his usual spot, the corner where he could see the door, and pulled his plate toward him. Cole said, "There's something I need to tell you." Owen looked up. "A woman is coming today, to stay here for a while." Owen was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of stillness that some children have, the ability to absorb information without immediately reacting, to hold it somewhere internal and process it at his own pace. Then he said, "What kind of woman?" Cole thought about how to answer this in a way that was honest without being more complicated than it needed to be. "The kind who's going to help us show the judge that things are good here, that this is a good place for you to grow up." Owen looked at his plate, then at his father. "Is she nice?" "I don't know her yet, but she might be." "She might be." Owen nodded once, the way he nodded when he was filing something away rather than concluding it, and went back to his breakfast. Cole watched him and felt the familiar compression in his chest that had no name he had ever found, the one that meant he loved this boy more than he knew how to say, and was afraid, most of the time, that love was not the same thing as enough. Wren Calloway had read the advertisement twice, standing in the back room of the dry goods store where she had found the newspaper, and then she had folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket, and walked home with it pressed against her ribs the entire way. She was not a woman who made decisions impulsively. She kept a small notebook with a blue cover. She had kept one since she was 12 years old, in which she recorded observations, plans, questions she had not yet answered. Her father had called this a strange habit. Victor Ashby, the one time they had met, had picked the notebook up from the table and set it back down without looking at it, and said that women were better served by learning to listen than by learning to keep records of what they heard. Wren had looked at him across the table and thought, clearly and without drama, that she would rather sleep in a barn than in a house with that man. She was the second daughter in a family that had once been comfortable, and was now the particular kind of not comfortable that people spend a great deal of energy pretending otherwise. Her father was a man who loved his children and was also a man who had made a series of decisions that had brought the family to a place where love was not sufficient protection against consequences. The debt was real. The arrangement with Victor Ashby was real. The wedding date, written in ink on a page her father had handed her without quite meeting her eyes, was 3 weeks away. Wren had sat with that information for 4 days. She had written in her notebook. She had thought about her sister, who had died when Wren was 15, and who had never been given the opportunity to make a single choice about the shape of her own life. She had thought about what it meant to walk through a door because someone else had opened it, versus walking through a door because you had found it yourself. Then she had written to Cole Hargrove. His reply had been brief, briefer than hers, which she had expected. He wrote without decoration, as though words were tools he selected for function rather than effect. He told her the situation plainly. The child, the hearing, the 60 days. He told her that if she came and it did not work, he would make sure she had enough to start over somewhere on her own terms. He did not promise her warmth. He did not promise her anything except honesty. And in the context of Wren's recent experience, honesty felt like something close to extravagance. She packed a single trunk and a smaller bag. Into the smaller bag, she put the blue notebook, a change of clothes, and a silver ring that had belonged to her sister. Not jewelry exactly, more like a reminder. Her sister had worn it on her right hand and said it was for keeping track of what mattered, though she had never explained precisely what she meant by that. Wren wore it sometimes and sometimes kept it in her pocket. She kept it in her pocket on the morning she left. She did not tell her father where she was going until the morning of. He sat at the breakfast table and looked at her trunk by the door and then at her face. And something in him seemed to understand that this was not a conversation he would win. He said, "Wren." She said, "I'll write when I'm settled." And she walked out the front door into the early light and did not look back. Not because she was not afraid, but because she had decided that fear was a thing she could carry with her rather than a reason to stand still. The town of Greystone materialized out of the landscape the way small towns in open country often did. Gradually, then all at once, a cluster of wooden structures arranged along a single main street as though they had gathered together for warmth and never found a reason to spread out. The coach came to a stop in a wash of dust, and Wren stepped down with her bag over one shoulder and her trunk following behind her, and the first thing she noticed was the wind. It moved through Greystone with a kind of casual authority, unhurried and unconcerned with the preference of anyone standing in it. The second thing she noticed was the man. He was standing apart from the small group of people who had gathered near the coach stop, tall enough that he was easy to find, with the kind of stillness about him that suggested he was not a man who fidgeted. He was wearing a dark coat and a hat that had clearly been worn longer than it had been new, and his eyes were doing the same thing to her that she was doing to him. A careful inventory, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply gathering information. Beside him, half a step back and slightly to his right, was the boy. Owen was smaller than she had imagined, though she was not sure why she had imagined him at any particular size. He had dark eyes and a serious face, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately because she had worn it herself. The expression of a person who has been disappointed before and is calculating the odds. Wren walked toward them. The dust settled around her shoes. Cole said, "Miss Calloway." Mr. Hargrove. He was not a man who used words to fill silence, which she had understood from his letters, but which was clearer in person. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read, and then he said, "I'll take the trunk." He did not ask. She let him. Then he said the thing he had decided to say, and she could tell he had decided it in advance because it came out with the weight of something prepared, not rehearsed, but considered. "I don't need a wife. I need someone to stand beside me in a hearing room long enough for a judge to believe this is a home. After 60 days, you can stay or you can go. I'll make sure you have what you need either way." Wren looked at Owen. The boy looked back at her steadily, waiting to see what she would do with this information. She looked back at Cole. "You're direct." It seemed important. It was. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. "I'll be direct back. I'm not here because I had no options. I'm here because this was the best option I had. There's a difference, and I want you to know I understand that." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something adjacent to it. A kind of recalibration. He said, "All right," and turned toward the wagon, and Wren fell into step beside him, and Owen walked on the other side of his father, and that was how they came back to Broken Spur for the first time. Ruth met them at the door. She was a small woman who held herself with the specific uprightness of someone who had learned long ago that dignity was not given but maintained. And she looked at Wren the way a person looks at a new piece of furniture, not unkindly, but with the practical consideration of someone deciding where it fits. She showed Wren to the room off the east side of the house, a clean room with a single window that looked out over the pasture, narrow but private. On the dresser there was a key. Wren picked it up. "Mr. Hargrove had the lock put in this morning," Ruth said, watching her. Wren turned the key over once in her hand and set it in her coat pocket beside her sister's ring. "Thank you," she said. Ruth nodded once and left. Wren sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Through the wall she could hear the low rhythm of Cole's voice, and then Owen's, shorter, quieter, then Cole's again. She could not make out the words. She did not try to. She took the blue notebook out of her bag and opened it to a fresh page and wrote the name of the town, and then one sentence below it. "He put a lock on the door before he knew me." She looked at the sentence for a moment, then closed the notebook and set it on the dresser beside the lamp. She was not someone who placed her hope in gestures. She had learned too young what it cost to read too much into small kindnesses, but she had also learned that small kindnesses were a kind of language, and the key in her pocket said something. Not everything, not yet. but something she intended to pay attention to. Through the window, the late afternoon light lay long and golden over the grass, and the wind moved through it in slow waves. And Greystone was small, and the ranch was harder than anything she was used to, and none of it was what she had imagined for herself at the age of 12, when she had first started filling notebooks with the record of what mattered. But she was here. She had chosen to be here. And that, for now, was enough. She did not sleep well, which she had expected. The room was unfamiliar in the specific way that all new rooms are. The sounds were wrong. The darkness was different. The walls exhaled the history of a house she did not yet know. She lay still and listened to broken spur settle into the night around her, cataloging the sounds the way she cataloged everything. The low groan of old timber contracting in the cold, the distant movement of horses in their stalls, the intermittent creak of a shutter somewhere on the north side of the house that had not been properly latched. These were not ominous sounds. They were the sounds of a place that was alive in the way that only inhabited places were alive. The accumulated evidence of all the mornings and evenings it had held, all the people who had moved through its rooms and left behind them the particular warmth of having been there. Sometime past the middle of the dark, she heard a different sound from outside and turned to look through the window. Cole was standing in the yard below. He stood with his back to the house, looking out at the dark line where the land met the sky. And there was a quality to his stillness that was different from the stillness she had seen in him at the coach stop. That had been controlled. This was not controlled. It was unguarded in the way that people are when they believe they are alone, when the version of themselves they present to the world has been set down for the night. He stood there for a long time. He did not move. He did not look at anything in particular. He simply stood in the dark with the wind moving past him, and Wren, watching from the window with the blanket pulled around her shoulders, understood with a sudden quiet certainty that he was not alone out there, that whatever he was standing with, it had a name, and that name was not loneliness exactly, and it was not grief exactly, though it was made of both. She did not understand it yet, but she recognized it. She had stood in her own dark with her own version of it, and she knew the shape of it the way you know the shape of something you have carried for long enough. She let the curtain fall back and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she thought about the 60 days ahead of her, and the boy with the careful eyes, and the man in the yard who did not know she was watching, and the key in her coat pocket that she had not been asked to earn. She thought about her sister, who had never had 60 days of anything that belonged entirely to herself. Wren reached for the notebook on the dresser and opened it in the dark without lighting the lamp, and ran her thumb over the page she had written earlier, feeling the slight impression of the ink without being able to read it. She closed it again and lay back down. Outside, the wind moved through the grass of broken spur in long, slow waves, and the dark held everything it always held, and the morning was still hours away, and Wren Calloway, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, did not wish she were somewhere else. The first week at Broken Spur passed the way unfamiliar things often do, slowly at the edges and too quickly at the center, so that by the end of it, Wren could not have said exactly when the strangeness began to wear away or what had replaced it. She learned the house by moving through it carefully, the way you learn a language by listening before you speak. She learned which door needed lifting slightly to close cleanly, and which window let in the cold if the latch was not fully turned, and that Ruth kept the good flour in the tin on the left and the ordinary flour in the tin on the right, and that these were not interchangeable in Ruth's understanding of how things should be done. She learned Cole by watching him, because watching was what she had. He rose before daylight every morning without exception, dressed in the dark, drank his coffee standing at the window that faced east, and was outside before the sky had fully decided on its color. He came in for meals and ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had been eating alone long enough that he had forgotten meals were ever intended to be social occasions. He said what was necessary and not much beyond it. He answered questions directly when she asked them and did not ask many in return. And at first she thought this was indifference. And then she revised that. It was more like respect, the kind that manifests as not requiring a person to explain themselves before they are ready. Owen she learned more slowly still, because Owen required patience of a specific kind, the patience of not trying. He did not warm to effort. He warmed to consistency, to the gradual accumulation of evidence that a person intended to remain. She had understood this from the first morning at the table, when he had looked at her with those careful dark eyes, and she had looked back at him without smiling too broadly, or speaking too warmly, or doing any of the things adults did when they were attempting to be liked by a child. She had simply said good morning and passed the bread and asked him if he wanted more eggs, and he had said, "No, thank you," in a voice that was still deciding whether she was worth the courtesy, and she had accepted that as a reasonable beginning. She did not try to make him like her. She tried to make him feel that she was not something to be managed. The ranch itself was another kind of learning. Broken Spur was not a large operation, but it had the density of a place that had been worked consistently for a long time. Every fence post driven by someone who intended to be there the following spring. Every structure built to last rather than to suffice. Wren walked its perimeter in the first days when she could find the time, mapping it the way she mapped everything, by moving through it slowly and paying attention. The barn smelled of hay and animal warmth and the particular sharpness of leather that has been oiled and used. The yard had a rhythm to it, the way yards do when the same tasks have been performed in the same sequence for years. The path worn between the house and the well, the spot near the fence where the ground was harder because Cole stood there every morning to watch the pasture before starting his day. She noticed these things and wrote some of them in the notebook and kept the rest in the part of her mind she reserved for the accumulation of what mattered. She was building a picture of a life that had been lived here, carefully, by a man who had not yet decided whether living it was still worth the effort. That was what she saw underneath the competence and the silence. Not despair exactly, but a suspension. A man who had stopped making plans that extended past the immediate necessity of the day. The ranch ran because it needed to run. Owen was cared for because Owen needed to be cared for. But there was a quality to the edges of things. The window in the front room that let in a draft because it had not been reglazed. The account books that were accurate but had not been projected forward. A man doing what was required, and no more. She understood this. She had lived in her own version of it for long enough to recognize the shape. It was on the fourth morning that she first noticed the yellow. She had set a pot of corn porridge on the table, a thing she had made without thinking, a staple of the household she had grown up in. And Owen had come to the table and looked at the pot and sat down, and was very quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet. He ate the bread and the eggs and left the porridge untouched. And when he left the table, he carried his plate to the counter without being asked, which Ruth had told her he always did, and went outside. Wren stood at the table and looked at the pot of yellow porridge and thought. She thought about it for 3 days. She watched Owen at every meal, noting without appearing to note, the way she had always noted things. Storing the observations in the part of her mind she kept organized the same way she kept the blue notebook organized, by significance rather than chronology. On the second day, she noticed that he did not take the yellow apple from the bowl on the counter, though the red ones disappeared steadily. On the third day, she was in the main room when she saw him pause at the doorway and look at the painting above the mantel. A small landscape, unremarkable except for the figure in the foreground, a woman in a yellow dress, standing with her back to the painter, looking out at something the viewer could not see. Owen looked at it for only a moment. Then he looked away and went upstairs. Wren stood very still in the main room after he had gone, and she did not take out her notebook because some things felt wrong to write down. She looked at the painting for a long time. She looked at the woman in the yellow dress. Then she went back to the kitchen and made a quiet change to the week's cooking that no one would comment on because no one would know to comment on it. The following evening, she set down bowls of beef stew, dark and rich, bread with butter, and sliced apples, red ones. Owen sat down and began eating without ceremony. Halfway through the meal, he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not quite recognition and not quite gratitude, something that lived between the two. Then he looked back at his bowl and finished his dinner and said, unprompted, "It's good." Cole looked up from his own plate. He looked at Owen, then at Wren. He said nothing, but his eyes stayed on her a moment longer than they needed to, and when he looked away again, something about the set of his shoulders was different, marginally, almost imperceptibly, but she noticed because she noticed everything. The next morning, there was a cup of coffee on the counter when she came downstairs. Cole was already outside. Ruth was at the stove with her back to the room. The coffee was still hot, which meant it had been set there recently, which meant he had heard her coming down the stairs and poured it before she arrived. Wren stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the cup. Then she walked over and picked it up and held it in both hands and let herself feel, just for a moment, the small, uncomplicated warmth of being anticipated. She did not say anything about it to Cole. She thought, correctly, that he would prefer it that way. On the 8th day, a man came from town. He arrived mid-morning while Cole was out checking the north fence, and Wren was in the kitchen helping Ruth put up the last of the autumn preserves. She heard the horse before she saw it, and came to the door to find a man in a dark coat dismounting in the yard with the practiced ease of someone who made a habit of arriving unannounced at places that did not belong to him. He was perhaps 50, with a neatly trimmed beard and the particular expression of professional pleasantness that Wren had learned to associate with people who wanted something and had been told to be careful about how they asked for it. He introduced himself as Mr. Aldred, representing the interests of the Whitmore family in the matter of the custody arrangement currently before the local circuit. He said this with the smooth cadence of a man accustomed to saying uncomfortable things in a way that made them sound administrative rather than adversarial. He asked if Mr. Hargrove was available. Wren told him Mr. Hargrove was working and would be back by midday. He said he would wait and did so by standing in the yard in a way that made the yard feel observed. When Cole returned, Wren watched from the kitchen window as the two men spoke. She could not hear the words. She watched Cole's face instead, which was easier to read in profile than straight on. She was learning that about him, that the angles revealed more than the front. His jaw set once, then released. He nodded twice. When Aldred turned to leave, he paused and looked toward the house, and his gaze found the window, and Wren held still and did not step back, because stepping back would have told him something she did not want him to know. When Cole came inside, he stood at the kitchen counter and did not immediately speak. Ruth made a point of being occupied elsewhere. Wren continued working on the jars in front of her and waited. Cole said, he wanted to see that things were as represented. What did he find? Cole looked at her. A woman in the kitchen helping with preserves, Owen's drawings on the table, a working ranch that looks like someone is taking care of it. He paused. He'll come back. I know. He'll be looking for reasons. Any kind. I understand. Wren set down the jar she was holding and turned to face him fully. Mr. Hargrove, I know what's at stake. I knew before I came. I'm not going to give him reasons. She said it quietly and without heat, and he looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being uncertain what to say next. Before he turned to go back outside, he said, Cole. She looked at him. You can call me Cole. He went out. She stood in the kitchen with a jar of plum preserves in her hand and listened to the door close behind him and thought that in the economy of a man like that, the offer of a first name was not a small thing. The days acquired a rhythm, the way days do when people are careful with each other. Wren cooked and kept the house and spent time with Owen in the particular way she had settled on. Present without pressing, available without demanding. She read in the evenings in the chair near the window, and sometimes Owen came and sat at the table nearby and drew in the sketchbook he kept close, and they occupied the same space in companionable parallel, two people who had separately decided that silence shared was better than silence alone. She was careful not to look at his drawings unless he showed her. She was careful about a great many things. She felt the 60 days moving beneath her like current, steady and directional, and she did not let herself think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead required assumptions about outcomes she could not yet see. One afternoon, she was outside near the well when Owen came around the corner of the barn with a length of rope he had been attempting to use for something she had not been able to determine from inside the kitchen window. He stopped when he saw her. Then he came closer and held out the rope and said, "Do you know how to do a square knot?" She did. Her sister had taught her, on a rainy afternoon, that Wren could still locate exactly in her memory the feel of the rope, the gray light from the window, her sister's hands over hers guiding the motion. She took the rope from Owen and showed him, slowly, the over and under and through of it, and he watched with his full attention the way he did everything. And then he took it back and tried it himself and got it wrong and tried again and got it right. "My dad says knots are important," he said, examining the result with the gravity of a craftsman assessing his own work. "He's right about that." Owen looked at her. "Do you know other ones?" She knew 4 others. They spent the better part of an hour on the fence rail with the rope between them, and by the end Owen could do 2 of them without prompting. The afternoon had gone cold around them without either of them appearing to notice, the kind of cold that arrives gradually until it is simply the condition of things. Owen's hands were reddening at the knuckles from the chill, and he did not mention it, and she did not mention it, and they worked through the bowline and the cleat hitch until the light began to change, and the ranch sounds shifted from afternoon to evening. She found herself thinking, not for the first time, that teaching someone something useful was its own form of conversation, more honest in some ways than words, because it required both people to pay attention to the same thing at the same time. When Cole came around the barn on his way from the pasture and saw them there, he stopped for a moment at a distance, and Wren did not acknowledge him because she understood instinctively that acknowledging him would change the quality of the moment, and she did not want it changed. Later, she heard him in the hallway outside Owen's room after the boy had gone to bed. The low, particular timbre of his voice and the shorter responses of his son, and though she was sitting at her own desk with the blue notebook open in front of her, she was not writing. She was listening without meaning to. She was feeling the shape of this house around her, and for the first time, she thought of it not as a temporary structure, but as a thing with rooms that had been lived in for a long time by people who loved each other and were doing their best. And she thought that love in this form, quiet, effortful, imperfect, was something she understood more than she had expected to. She wrote in the notebook, "He taught the boy that knots matter." She paused, then added, "I think he is trying to teach him that things hold." It was on the 16th day that she saw Victor Ashby. She had gone into Greystone for the supplies that Ruth had listed out on a folded piece of paper, a task she had taken on because she wanted to know the town, and because Ruth's knees were bad in the cold, and because doing useful things was how Wren kept herself from thinking too carefully about the things she could not yet control. She had been in Greystone 3 times before this, enough to know the layout of the main street and the name of the man at the general store, and the fact that the woman who ran the seamstress shop on the corner had a fondness for watching who came and went through the front window. She was coming out of the dry goods store with her basket when she saw them. 2 men standing outside the office of the local magistrate, a narrow building set back slightly from the main street. One she did not recognize, a man in late middle age, heavy-set, with the unremarkable appearance of someone who had spent years being deliberately forgettable. The other was Victor Ashby. She knew him from a single meeting, the kind of meeting that leaves a person clearly in the memory precisely because of how much was wrong about it. He was older than she was by 2 decades and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had confused money with authority for long enough that the two had become indistinguishable to him. He was standing outside the magistrate's office in the middle of the morning, talking to this man she did not recognize, and the way they stood together, not like strangers exchanging pleasantries, but like men who had met before and were continuing something already in progress, made Wren stop on the boardwalk with her basket over her arm and go very still inside. She watched them. Ashby said something she could not hear, and the other man nodded. Then the other man turned and went back inside the magistrate's office, and Ashby stood on the street for a moment looking at nothing in particular, and Wren stepped back into the shadow of the store doorway and waited until he had turned away and walked in the opposite direction. She stood there for a moment. The basket was in her hands. The wind moved down the main street of Greystone, and she felt it as a thing with weight. Then she walked to the bench outside the dry goods store, sat down, and opened her blue notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the day. She wrote what she had seen, the name, the location, the other man, the body language that said continuation rather than introduction. She wrote it quickly and precisely, the way she had always written the things that mattered, capturing the details before memory softened them. She did not yet know what it meant. She knew it was not a coincidence. She knew that Victor Ashby had not come to Greystone for its hospitality or its scenery or any reason that had nothing to do with her. She knew that he was the kind of man who, when he decided on something, applied pressure through channels, legal, financial, social, rather than through direct confrontation, because direct confrontation could be defended against, and channels were harder to locate until the water was already moving. She closed the notebook and put it back in her bag and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, thinking. Then she picked up her basket and finished the list and walked back to the ranch. And she did not tell Cole what she had seen. Not yet. She wanted to know more before she spoke. She wanted to understand the shape of what was being arranged before she named it to someone else, because naming things badly was worse than not naming them at all. But that night, lying awake in the narrow room with the key to the lock in her coat pocket, she felt the 60 days differently. She felt them the way you feel borrowed time, not with despair exactly, but with a sharper attention to what was passing. On the 21st day, a letter arrived. It came in the afternoon post, addressed to Wren in handwriting she did not immediately recognize, which meant it had not come from anyone in her family. She turned it over. The return had only initials, and a town she did not know. She opened it at the kitchen table after Cole had gone back out and Ruth had retired to her room for the hour she took each afternoon for reasons she did not explain, and no one asked about. The letter was from a man named James Whitmore. He was, she gathered from the letter's tone, the brother of Cole's late wife. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first introduced him. The second said, plainly, that she was not what she appeared to be, and that he had taken steps to verify her background and found it wanting. The third said, equally plainly, that her presence at Broken Spur was a disruption to a family that had already suffered enough, and that the kindest thing she could do would be to conclude this arrangement quietly and leave before she caused further damage to people who did not deserve it. It was a well-written letter. She could tell he had composed it carefully and believed every word of it. She folded it and held it in her hands for a moment, looking at the table, at the grain of the old wood, at the ring of a coffee cup that had sat in this same spot long enough to leave a mark. She thought about what it meant that 2 men, Ashby and now Whitmore, were each working from separate directions. She thought about Owen outside somewhere with his sketchbook, drawing things he kept private. She thought about the knot she had taught him at the fence rail, and about her sister, and about the particular quality of the afternoon light coming through the window of this kitchen, in a house she had not chosen, but was beginning, cautiously, to recognize. She put the letter in the pocket of her skirt. Then she walked to the door and looked out across the yard to where Owen was sitting on the bottom rail of the near fence, his sketchbook on his knees, the pencil moving in small, careful strokes. The wind moved his hair across his forehead. He did not look up. Wren stepped off the porch and walked across the yard and climbed up to sit on the rail beside him, leaving a few inches of space between them. She looked out at the pasture. He kept drawing. They sat that way for a while in the kind of quiet that had weight and texture, the kind that meant something was being decided. Then Owen shifted. Not much, just slightly. The way a person makes room when they have decided the space beside them is not empty anymore, but occupied, and the occupation is acceptable. He moved perhaps 3 inches to the left and went on drawing, and Wren felt the smallness of those 3 inches as something that had no adequate word for it, a measurement that existed in a system more precise than the ones she had learned. She sat there until the light began to change, and she did not take out the letter again, and she did not take out the notebook, and she did not reach toward the boy, or speak or try to become anything other than what she currently was, a woman sitting on a fence rail next to a child who had decided, 3 inches at a time, that she was allowed to stay. Later that evening, Cole found her on the porch after Owen had gone to bed. The night had come in cold and clear, the stars very bright, the way they were in open country where there was nothing to compete with them. The cold had the clean particular quality of open country night, different from the cold she had known before, less the cold of buildings and streets and the collective warmth of many people nearby, more the cold of a place that did not modify itself for human comfort, that simply was what it was, and left you to decide how to meet it. She had found, over these weeks, that she preferred this. She had found a great many things about this place that she preferred, quietly and without making much of it. He stood in the doorway for a moment before coming out, and she thought he had something to say but was deciding how. He sat down in the other chair. They were quiet together for a while, which was becoming, she noticed, less effortful than it had been in the first days. "Aldred will be back next week," Cole said. "He told me at the supply store. He said the hearing date has been moved forward." Wren looked out at the dark. "All right. He said the Whitmore family's legal representation is more engaged than I expected." "I know." She paused. "I received a letter today. From James Whitmore." Cole turned to look at her. "He knows my background, or some of it." She kept her voice steady because the situation called for steadiness, not because she did not feel the other things. "He's been looking into where I came from and why I left." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "And what did you do with the letter?" "I kept it. I'm recording what I can. I want to understand the full shape of this before I know what to do with the information." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not quite surprise, not quite reassessment, something that had the quality of a man revising a conclusion he had already drawn and finding the revision more interesting than the original. He looked back out at the dark. "You've been doing that since you arrived," he said. "Watching, recording." She said nothing. "I saw you," he said, without accusation. "With the notebook. I didn't read it. I just saw you working something out." He paused. "Ruth said you were the first person who'd come to this ranch in a long time who didn't ask what the land was worth before they got off the coach." Wren turned to look at him. He was still looking out at the pasture, but his jaw had shifted in the way it did when he was saying something he had been working up to. "I didn't ask," she said, "because that wasn't what I came for." A silence, the kind that was becoming familiar, loaded but not uncomfortable, the kind that meant something was being understood rather than said. "What did you come for?" he asked. She thought about the honest answer, and then she gave it. "A door that was mine to walk through." Cole looked at her then. The night was quiet around them, the stars indifferent and brilliant. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he has been avoiding for a long time, not because it frightened him, but because he had not yet determined whether he deserved it. Then he looked back out at the dark, and the moment passed, and neither of them spoke again for a while, and the silence between them was not empty. From inside the house, through the window above them, came the small sound of Owen turning over in his sleep. The creak of the bed, the settling of the blankets. Cole tilted his head slightly, the automatic listening of a father, and then relaxed when no further sound came. Wren thought about the letter in her skirt pocket, and the man she had seen outside the magistrate's office, and the weeks that stood between now and the hearing. She thought about the notebook on her dresser, and the line she had written, and what it meant to be a person who recorded things, not because the record was armor, but because the record was evidence. Evidence that she had been here, had paid attention, had taken the measure of what was real. And then, because there was nothing she could do about any of it tonight, and because the stars were very bright, and the man sitting beside her had just offered her, in his own imprecise and honest way, a fragment of his confidence, she let the thinking rest. She sat in the chair with her hands folded in her lap and felt the cold air on her face, and did not wish herself anywhere else. Tomorrow there would be more to do. Tomorrow the 60 days would be fewer, and the shape of what was coming would be clearer, and she would open the notebook and write down what she knew. But tonight, the porch held them both, and the dark was quiet. And for now, that was enough. The shift came on a morning that was unremarkable in every external way. The sky was the particular gray of late autumn pressing toward winter, low and seamless, and the wind had acquired an edge that it had not had the week before. Wren was at the kitchen table with the blue notebook open and the letter from James Whitmore beside it, cross-referencing what she had observed against what she suspected, when Cole came in from the north pasture earlier than usual and stood in the doorway long enough that she looked up. He had the expression he wore when something had settled in him, not peace exactly, but resolution, the look of a man who had been arguing with himself and reached a conclusion. He came to the table and sat down across from her, which was not what he usually did when he came in from the fields. Usually, he went to the counter, poured water, stood and drank it looking out the window, then went back to whatever came next. Sitting down at the table in the middle of the afternoon was a departure, and departures from McColl's patterns meant something. He looked at the letter, and then at the notebook, and then at her. "Tell me what you know," he said, "about Ashby, about what he's doing here. All of it." She closed the notebook. She had been deciding for several days when to have this conversation, and she recognized that he had decided for her, which was its own kind of relief. She told him about the meeting outside the magistrate's office, the posture, the familiarity, the way the other man had gone back inside as though returning to his own place. She told him about the letter from James Whitmore, and what it implied about how much coordination was happening between the two. She laid it out the way she laid everything out, in order, with the details that mattered and without the ones that didn't. When she finished, Cole was quiet. He looked at the table. She could see him working through it, the way he worked through everything, methodically, without hurry, not jumping to the conclusion, but walking toward it at the pace the ground required. "He's not here for you," Cole said finally. "Not only for you. If he were just trying to bring you back, he would have sent someone to the ranch directly. He's here because he found a way to combine what he wants with what the Whitmore family wants. And between the two of them, they have enough access to the right people to make things difficult before the hearing. Yes, Wren said. That's what I think too. Cole looked at her. You came here knowing this was possible. I came here knowing it was likely. She held his gaze. I told you. This was the best option I had. I didn't say it was a simple one. He nodded slowly. Then he said, You're not what I expected. She waited because she could tell there was more. I expected someone who needed a situation, he said. I didn't expect someone who was already managing one. Wren said, I think most women are managing something. It's usually just not visible. Cole looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was beginning to be able to read. Not the closed face he presented to the town, not the careful, measured expression he used at the table with Owen, but the one underneath both of those, the one that was simply him, unmediated. It was a face that had been used hard and was still standing, and she found it more trustworthy than a face that hadn't. He said, We'll need to be more deliberate about what Aldred sees, about how things look. Agreed. That means being present together, more than we have been. Also agreed. He nodded again and stood and went back to the counter, and she thought the conversation was over, but then he said without turning around, I'm glad you told me. He went back outside. Wren sat at the table and looked at the closed blue notebook and thought that she was glad too. The evenings began to change. It happened gradually and then more noticeably, the way temperature changes, imperceptibly, until you realize you have reached for a heavier coat without deciding to. Cole began staying in after supper longer than he had before, not by much, but enough. He sat at the table with his coffee while Wren read or wrote, and sometimes they talked about practical things, the state of the north fence, the supplies that were running low, what Owen needed for the colder weeks ahead. And sometimes they didn't talk at all, just occupied the kitchen together in a silence that had become, without either of them announcing it, a comfortable thing. Owen noticed. Children notice everything and rarely comment on what they notice, preferring to store it and observe whether it persists. And Owen was more attuned to his environment than most children his age. He began coming downstairs after supper on evenings when both of them were in the kitchen, on the pretext of needing water or retrieving something from his coat, and then staying, finding a reason to remain that was thin enough that all three of them knew it was a pretext, and no one said so. One such evening, he sat at the table with them and drew for nearly an hour while Wren read and Cole went over the account books. And when he finally went upstairs and they heard his door close, Cole looked up from the books and across at Wren, and the moment held something in it. A quality of recognition, of two people who had separately noticed the same thing and were acknowledging it without having to name it directly. Ruth, for her part, had adopted the expression of someone who had formed a strong opinion and was exercising restraint about sharing it. She moved through the kitchen with a barely perceptible air of satisfaction that she would have denied if asked. Wren found it quietly amusing and said nothing, because some things were better left in the register of the understood. It was on a cold afternoon, the light going early, the way it did in the later part of autumn, that Cole took her to the far side of the property. He had been fixing the fence line that ran along the ridge, a job that had been waiting for weeks, kept deferring as other things pressed forward. And Wren had brought out coffee and stayed to hold the wire while he worked, which was a practical arrangement and was also something else, though neither of them named the something else. They worked along the line for a while, not speaking much, the cold moving around them with its own authority. When the section was done, Cole straightened and looked out over the land below the ridge. The sun was low and sideways, the particular golden slant of it that happened only in this season, and it laid itself across the grass in long strips and made the country look like something from a painting. Wren stood beside him and looked at it and did not say that it was beautiful because it seemed unnecessary to say. The cold had settled into her fingers from holding the wire, and her back ached slightly from the angle of the work, and the wind was picking up from the north with the smell of something colder coming behind it. These were not unpleasant things. They were the specific, real sensations of a body engaged in actual work in an actual place, and she had come to understand over these weeks that she had been missing this. Not the physical effort exactly, but the groundedness of it, the way hard work in open country organized the mind around what was immediate and left less room for the circling kind of thought that had been her companion in her previous life. After a moment, Cole began walking again, not back toward the house, but along the ridge, and she fell into step beside him, and they walked until the fence line ended at a stand of old trees, and beyond the trees, set back slightly and sheltered from the wind, there was a small grave marked with a flat stone. Cole stopped. He did not look at her. He looked at the stone. She stood beside him and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say, and she had learned that Cole's silences were not empty spaces waiting to be filled, but structures that held weight and needed to be respected as such. He stood there for a long time. The wind moved through the branches of the old trees above them with a sound like breath. The light was going now, the gold draining slowly out of the sky. Then he said, without looking away from the stone, she liked this spot. She said on clear days you could see all the way to where the land changes color. He paused. I haven't been up here in a long time. Wren waited. I told myself it was because there wasn't time, he said. That was not the only reason. Another pause. She could see the line of his jaw from where she stood, and the way the fading light caught it, and she thought that grief made different things of different people. It had made him harder outward and more careful inward, and she understood both impulses. The night she died, he said, and then stopped. Started again. She had been. It happened gradually, the way some things do. Months of gradual. I knew how ill she was. I knew the winter was harder on her than she let on. And that evening, I was in the barn, 20 steps from the house. She needed me, and Owen was in there alone with her, and I was 20 steps away. His voice did not break, but it changed. Thinned, the way metal thins under pressure, without fracturing. He kept his eyes on the stone. I've run that evening through my head more times than I can count, he said. Every version ends the same way. But I keep running it, thinking if I'd come in earlier, if I'd checked on her an hour before I did, if I had been the kind of man who came in before he was finished instead of after. He stopped. Owen was 9 years old, and he was there alone when she... He stopped again. I was 20 steps away. Wren turned to look at him fully. He was not crying. He was something harder than crying. He was standing inside the thing directly, without protection, which was in some ways more difficult to witness than grief expressed. His hands were at his sides, and they were not still, not quite, and she understood what it had cost him to walk up here and stand in this spot and say these words out loud to another person. She did not say, it was not his fault. She understood that what he needed was not absolution from her. He had not asked for it and would not have been able to receive it from her even if she'd offered, because absolution for this kind of guilt could not come from outside, only from inside, and only after a long time. She did not say it was not his fault, and she did not say she was sorry, and she did not say what she had seen in him over the past weeks that suggested he was a better father and a better man than the story he was telling himself. She said, "Does Owen know you carry this?" Cole turned to look at her. The question had surprised him. She could see that. "No," he said. "He should know." Cole looked back at the stone. "It's not something a child needs to... He needs to know that his father also knows how to hurt," she said, quietly but without softening the edges. "Not the details, not the guilt, just that his father is someone who can be broken and is still standing." Children who grow up watching adults pretend they cannot be broken learn that breaking is shameful. That's a hard thing to unlearn. She paused. "My father never let us see him struggle. By the time I understood what he was actually carrying, it was too late to help him with it." Cole was quiet for a long time. The last of the light was gone from the ridge now, the sky shifting from gold to the deep, clear blue of early dark. The stone had gone from something visible to something felt. "You lost someone," he said. Not a question. "My sister. When I was 15. She looked at the stone. "She was ill for 2 years before she died. I used to go into her room at night and just sit there, because I thought my presence might, I don't know, help somehow, keep something in place." She paused. "It didn't. But I never stopped being glad I went." Cole looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen from him before. Open, unguarded, the face of a man who has been holding himself in place through great effort and has let the effort drop, just for a moment, just here, in the going dark with the old trees overhead and the stone that meant everything, and the woman standing beside him who had not tried to take the weight, but had simply agreed to stand in the same place it was. After a moment, he said, "She would have found you interesting." It was such an unexpected thing that Wren felt the back of her throat tighten, which surprised her. She looked straight ahead and waited until the tightness passed. "I'll take that," she said. Cole nodded once, the way he nodded when he was concluding something. Then he turned and walked back down the ridge toward the house, and she walked beside him, and they did not speak again for a while, but the silence between them had a different quality now. It had been changed by what had been said in it, the way a room is changed by a fire that has gone out, still holding the warmth. She thought about what it had cost him to bring her here, to this particular piece of ground, to stand at this particular stone and say these particular words. She thought about how long he had been carrying what he had said, not the grief itself, which was visible in him the way water is visible in a landscape, shaping everything, always present, but the specific guilt, the 20 steps version of events that he had been running and rerunning in the private cinema of his mind for 3 years. She thought that the willingness to say a hard thing out loud to a person who was listening was one of the quieter forms of courage, less dramatic than the other kinds, but no less real. That night, she heard him in Owen's room. She was at her desk with the notebook open, not writing but sitting with her hands flat on the pages, when she heard the low murmur of Cole's voice through the wall, and then Owen's, and then a silence, and then Cole's voice again, longer this time. the cadence of someone saying something they have prepared. She could not hear the words. She did not need to. She sat at her desk and kept her hands flat on the notebook pages and felt the warmth of the wall at her back, and thought about her sister, and about the way that love, in its most honest form, was very often just the willingness to say the true thing, even when the true thing was difficult. After a while, she heard Cole's footsteps in the hallway, and they paused outside her door, and then continued on, and she heard the faint sound of his door closing at the end of the hall. She picked up the pen. She wrote, "He went to the boy tonight. That is the bravest thing I have seen him do." She closed the notebook and went to sleep. This time, the unfamiliar sounds of the house were less foreign than they had been, because she had begun to know them well enough to trust them. In the days that followed, something shifted in Owen. It was not dramatic. It was not a transformation of the kind that happened in stories where children decided all at once to trust and then did. It was smaller than that, and more durable. He began appearing in the kitchen in the mornings not just for breakfast, but sometimes early, before the meal was ready, sitting at the corner of the table with his sketchbook, drawing while Wren cooked. He did not talk much. He didn't need to, but the drawings began to change. She could see this without looking directly. In the peripheral way, she noticed everything. They became less spare, more populated. The figures in them acquired details they had not had before. Specificity where there had been suggestion. She thought about what it meant when a child started putting detail into the things he drew. The decision, perhaps not conscious, that the world was worth the effort of that kind of attention, that it would remain long enough to justify recording its particulars. She thought that this might be one of the more honest measures of whether a child felt safe. Not what he said, but what he drew. One morning, he set his sketchbook on the table and went outside, and she looked at it without touching it, the way you look at something you have been given permission to see by its deliberate placement rather than by any spoken word. The drawing on the open page showed 3 horses in a field, and in the corner, very small, 2 figures, one tall, one shorter, standing at a fence rail, their hands making shapes that she recognized after a moment as knots. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back to the stove. When Owen came in for breakfast, he sat down and ate without mentioning the sketchbook, and she did not mention it either. But when she set his plate down, she said, very quietly, "The horses look good." And Owen looked up at her with those dark, careful eyes and said, "I'm still working on them," and went back to eating. And that was all. And it was also, she thought, quite a lot. Cole found her at her desk that evening, the blue notebook open, the lamp burning low. He knocked on the door frame. He always knocked, which she had come to regard as the clearest possible expression of his character. And she turned in her chair. He held an envelope, sealed, worn at the edges, the paper gone soft with handling. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not quite entering, holding the envelope in both hands, the way you hold something you are not sure you are ready to let go of. "Ruth gave me this today," he said. "She's been holding it for 3 years. He looked at the envelope. "It's from my wife. She wrote it before she died. Ruth said she'd been waiting until—" He stopped. "She said she'd been waiting until she thought I was ready." Wren looked at him. He was standing very still, and the lamplight caught the lines of his face, and she thought about how a face told the story of everything that had happened to it, if you knew how to look. "She gave it to you today," Wren said. Yes. Why today? Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, I asked Ruth the same thing. He looked down at the envelope. She said she'd watched me go up to the ridge this afternoon and come back different. She said she'd been watching for that particular difference for 3 years. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and moved against the windows with a sound like something testing the boundaries of things. Cole looked at her. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it. Not distressed, not frightened, but standing at the edge of something with the particular look of a man who has decided to take the step without being certain of the ground. I haven't opened it yet, he said. I'm not sure I should open it alone. Wren held very still. She understood what he was asking, and she understood what it cost him to ask it, and she understood that the correct response was not to fill the space with words, but to let him stand in what he had said long enough to know she had received it. She stood up from the desk. She moved one of the chairs and set it beside the other, near the lamp. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the empty chair beside her and waited. Cole stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he came in. He sat down in the chair beside her. He held the envelope in both hands and looked at it, and neither of them spoke. After a while, he opened it. He read it to himself first, in silence, and she watched the movement of his eyes across the page, watched the set of his shoulders change as he read, not dramatically but perceptibly, the way a man's body changes when he receives something he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. She watched him read a second time, more slowly, the way you read something when you want to be certain you have understood it correctly rather than the way you want it to be. When he reached the end, he held the letter in his lap and was still for a long time. The lamp cast its warm circle around them both, and the house was quiet in the particular way it got after Owen had gone to sleep. A living quiet, occupied rather than empty, the silence of a place that held people rather than merely contained them. Then he said, "There's a part she wrote." He stopped, cleared his throat. She wrote, "You always believed that the weight was yours to carry alone. Our son needs to see something different. Let someone stand beside you. Not because you need to be carried, but because standing with someone is its own kind of strength." He folded the letter carefully along its original lines. He held it in both hands again. The lamplight was warm and low, and the house was quiet around them, and outside the wind moved through the dark of the ranch. "She was always clearer than I was," he said. "She sounds like someone who knew you very well," Wren said. "Better than I knew myself." A pause. "Better than I've let anyone know me since." She did not say anything to that, because it did not require response. It required only that she remain exactly where she was, which she did. After a long time, Cole turned and looked at her. Not the assessing look of the first days, not the careful, measured expression he wore in public, but the unmediated one, the one that had no audience and no defense, the one she had only ever seen from him in moments of complete unguardedness. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been approaching slowly for a long time, and have finally drawn close enough to see clearly. He said, "Wren." Just her name, nothing after it. But the way he said it was different from every other time, and she heard the difference, and she did not look away. Outside, the wind shifted. The lamp held its light. And the 60 days, which had been a structure and a deadline and a borrowed thing, felt, for the first time, like something different entirely, like the beginning of a longer count, one without a specified end, measured not in days but in the accumulation of evenings like this one, in knots taught at fence rails and drawings left on tables and silences that were fuller than most people's words. She did not say any of this. She held it the way she held the things that mattered most, carefully, privately, with the full attention of someone who understood that the best things were also the most breakable, and that understanding this was not a reason to hold back, but a reason to hold on with greater care. The lamp burned. The house settled around them, and Wren Calloway sat in the warm light of a room that had belonged to someone else's grief, and was quietly, carefully, becoming something else, something that did not yet have a name, but that she intended to stay for. The hearing room was smaller than Wren had imagined, which made everything in it feel more compressed. The weight of it, the silence of it, the particular quality of air that collects in rooms where consequential things are decided. It was a plain space, functional, with two long tables facing a raised platform behind which the circuit magistrate sat with papers arranged before him and the expression of a man who had presided over enough of these proceedings to have stopped finding them remarkable. The morning light came through two narrow windows on the east wall and fell in pale strips across the floor, and it was the kind of light that did not flatter anything. Wren sat beside Cole at the left table. She had dressed carefully, not elaborately, because elaborateness would have been wrong, would have read as performance, and she had spent enough time thinking about how things read to know the difference between presentation and performance. She wore the gray dress that was her best without being her finest, and she had her hair pinned simply, and she kept her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her posture straight without being rigid, the posture of someone who was not afraid to be seen. Cole sat beside her with the stillness he brought to everything, but she had been studying his stillness long enough now to read its variations. This was not the stillness of calm. This was the stillness of a man holding himself in place by an act of continuous will, which was different, and which she could see in the set of his hands on the table, not quite flat, not quite fists, somewhere in between. On the right table sat Mr. Aldred, the Whitmore family's representative, with papers of his own arranged before him. Beside him, to Wren's careful surprise, sat James Whitmore himself. She had not expected him to appear in person, had expected the letter to be the extent of his direct involvement. He was a man in his mid-40s, lean, with a face that held genuine sorrow alongside its determination, and she found herself, despite everything, unable to reduce him to simple opposition. He believed what he was doing was right. That was the most complicated kind of opponent. Victor Ashby was not in the room. She had expected him to be absent. His method was infrastructure, not presence, the moving of pieces before the game rather than during it. He had done what he came to do. The rest was Aldred's work. The magistrate called the proceeding to order. Aldred spoke first, as she had known he would. He was a practiced speaker, measured, unhurried, with the particular skill of making arguments sound like observations, as though he were simply noting what anyone reasonable would notice. He spoke about stability, about the nature of a home, about the circumstances under which the current domestic arrangement at Broken Spur had been established, and here he paused, just briefly, to let the word established carry its own weight. He said that the arrangement had been entered into under circumstances that raised questions about its voluntary nature, particularly as regarded Miss Calloway, whose own history of difficult circumstances might make her susceptible to decisions made from necessity rather than genuine intent. Wren kept her hands folded on the table and her face composed and listened to her own life being summarized by someone who understood its outline and none of its interior. And she thought about the blue notebook in her bag beside her chair, and about what it meant to record things carefully, and about all the things Aldred did not know because they could not be found in any document or letter or account of external events. When Aldred finished, James Whitmore spoke briefly, more briefly than she had expected, and with a directness that was almost disarming. He said he loved his late sister. He said he had loved Owen since the boy was born and continued to love him. He said he was not here to harm Cole or to harm anyone, only to ensure that the boy grew up in a situation that was genuinely stable and not assembled for the benefit of a proceeding. He sat down, and the sorrow on his face was real, and Wren felt the complexity of the room press against her like weather. The magistrate looked at Cole. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "you may respond." Cole had prepared something. She knew this, had known it from the way he had sat at the kitchen table 2 nights before with a piece of paper and a pen, writing and crossing out, the same deliberate economy he applied to everything. She had not asked to see it. He had not offered to show her. They had been past the point of asking permission for certain things, and the writing had been one of them. He stood. He spoke without notes, which meant he had prepared enough that the notes became unnecessary, or perhaps that he had decided the notes would come between him and the words he needed to say. He spoke about Owen, not abstractly, not in the language of provision and stability that Aldred had used, but in the specific, particular language of a father who knew his son. He spoke about the square knots at the fence rail and about how Owen had shown him his hands afterward with the expression of a boy who has proved something to himself. He spoke about the drawings left on the kitchen table, how they had changed over the weeks, becoming more detailed, more populated, as though the boy had been given permission by some interior process to put more of the world onto the page. He spoke about the way Owen had begun coming downstairs in the evenings and staying, not asked to, not directed, simply choosing to be in the room where the 2 adults were. He spoke about a child learning, slowly and at his own pace, that the people around him intended to remain. He did not speak about love because he was not a man who used that word easily or in rooms like this, but the word was present in everything he said, the way a current is present in still water. Then the magistrate looked at Cole and asked the question, "Mr. Hargrove, I want to ask you directly. Did you enter this arrangement voluntarily, not under duress, not as a transaction, but as a genuine decision about your life and your son's life?" The room was very quiet. Wren kept her eyes on the table in front of her. She had decided sometime in the night before that she would not look at Cole during this question, because looking at him would be a kind of pressure, and he did not need pressure. He needed space to answer without the weight of her wanting something from him. She looked at the table. She heard him breathe. Then she felt his eyes on her. She knew without looking. The particular quality of being looked at by someone who is deciding something significant and who has chosen you as the place where they fix their attention while they decide it. She looked up. He was looking at her, not at the magistrate, not at the papers, not at the middle distance where people look when they are composing themselves, at her. And his expression was the one she had last seen in the lamplight of her room when he had read from the letter, open, unguarded, with no audience and no defense. He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he looked at the magistrate. "I started this as an arrangement," he said. "I'll be honest about that because this room deserves honesty, and so does my son, who's going to hear about what was said here someday." He paused. "But I am not here today because of an arrangement. I am here because over the past weeks I have watched a woman come into a house that had gone quiet and remind it how to be a home. Not by pretending, not by performing stability for the benefit of anyone watching. By being present. By being the kind of person who notices what a child needs before he knows how to ask for it. By being someone I have come to..." He stopped, chose the word, trust. The room was still. "So, to answer your question directly," Cole said, "yes, this is a genuine decision. It stopped being anything else some time ago." Wren looked back at the table. She was aware of her own breathing, and of the extraordinary effort required to keep her expression composed, and she was not entirely certain she succeeded, but she kept her eyes down and her hands folded and let the moment be what it was. The magistrate made a note. He said he would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 7 days. He struck his small gavel against the platform once, and the proceeding was over, and the morning light still lay in pale strips across the floor. And outside the narrow windows, the town of Greystone moved through its ordinary business, as though nothing of particular consequence had just occurred within these walls. Outside, the air was cold and direct in the way of late autumn, and Wren stood on the wooden step of the hearing building and let it reach her. She heard Cole behind her and then beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The street before them held the ordinary traffic of a working town. A wagon moving slowly, 2 men in conversation near the post, a dog asleep in a patch of thin sunlight. Then, from behind them, she heard footsteps, and Victor Ashby's voice. He said her name, just her name, in the tone he had used at their one meeting. Not unkind, not warm. The tone of a man who had long since stopped distinguishing between people and positions. She turned. He was standing at the base of the step, hands in his coat pockets, the picture of a man with nowhere particular to be. He had the expression she remembered, pleasant, patient, and underneath the patience, something that had no patience at all. "I hope the proceeding went well," he said. She said nothing. "I want you to know," he said, and here his voice shifted slightly, dropped a register toward something that was meant to sound like sincerity, that none of this needed to be complicated. Your family has obligations. Those obligations don't disappear because you chose a different geography. He paused. Your father is not a young man, and the situation at home has not improved in your absence. If anything... Stop, she said. He stopped. She looked at him. She had thought about this moment, not specifically, not knowing it would come in this form, but she had thought about the version of it that lived in her. The conversation she had been having with Victor Ashby in her own mind since the morning she had walked out of her family's house with a trunk and a bag and her sister's ring in her pocket. She had thought about what she would say if she were given the opportunity to say it clearly, without the constraint of a table across from him, without her father in the room, without the particular vulnerability of someone who has not yet found a place to stand. She had a place to stand now. She had been building it, quietly, for weeks, one careful day at a time, and she felt it under her in this moment. Solid, earned. You came here, she said, to arrange a situation rather than to address one. You have been working through other people and other channels because direct confrontation requires accountability, and you have made a long practice of avoiding accountability. You found a family's grief and used it as a lever because that is what you do. You find what is already broken and apply pressure to the break. She kept her voice level. It was not difficult. She was not angry, precisely. She was clear, which was better. My father's situation is my father's situation, and it will be addressed by my father and by those who love him, and not by me agreeing to a life I did not choose in exchange for a debt I did not incur. Ashby looked at her. The pleasant expression had not moved, but something behind it had. Some assumption about how this conversation would proceed had been revised, and the revision had cost him something he had not budgeted for. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said. "No," she said. "You did that." She turned. Cole was standing beside her. She was not certain exactly when he had moved from where he had been standing to where he was now, but he was there, close enough that his arm was at her elbow, not touching but present, a fact of space that Ashby would have to calculate. Cole looked at Ashby the way he looked at problems that required addressing, directly, without performance. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He simply stood there in the cold morning beside Wren, and the statement of it was complete. Ashby looked at them for a moment. Then he put his hands deeper in his coat pockets and turned and walked away down the street, and she watched him go, and the dog sleeping in the patch of thin sunlight did not stir, and the ordinary business of the town continued around his departure as though it had been of no consequence. Wren felt something she had been carrying for a long time, not grief, not fear, but a kind of vigilance, a permanent state of readiness for the next blow. Ease, slightly, like a muscle that has been held tense for so long, it has forgotten what it means to release. She understood, watching him walk away with his hands in his pockets and his particular air of studied indifference, that he had come to Greystone with leverage and was leaving without it. Men like that did not linger where they had been rendered irrelevant. Whatever he would do next, he would do it somewhere else, with someone else's grief, not hers, not anymore. She exhaled. Cole did not say anything for a moment. Then, "You prepared that?" "I thought about it." "In the notebook." She looked at him. There was something at the corner of his mouth that was almost, nearly, the thing she had been watching for since she arrived. "Some of it," she said. He nodded once. They walked back toward the wagon. The 7 days of waiting moved in the particular slow way of days when something is pending. Wren worked. She cooked and kept the house and helped Owen with the reading he had been neglecting in the weeks before she arrived. She wrote in the blue notebook. She sat with Cole in the evenings in the now familiar way, and they talked about the ranch and about Owen and sometimes about nothing in particular, which was the kind of talking that meant the most because it meant nothing was required. On the 4th evening of waiting, Wren came downstairs after midnight and found the kitchen lit by a single lamp and Owen sitting at the table. He was in his nightclothes, barefoot, with a blanket around his shoulders and his sketchbook open in front of him. He looked up when she came in, and his expression held something she had not seen from him in the full weight of it before. Not the careful watchfulness, not the measuring look, but a kind of nakedness, the face of a child who has been sitting alone with something too large for one person and has decided to let someone else into the room with it. She went to the stove and put water on to heat. She got 2 cups. She sat down across from him and waited. After a while, he said, "What if they say we have to leave?" She looked at him. "You mean, what if the magistrate rules in the Whitmore family's favor?" "Yes." She considered her answer with the care it deserved, because he was 9 years old and he was asking a real question, and real questions deserved real answers, not the cushioned kind that protected the person giving the answer more than they helped the person receiving it. "Then your father and the people who love you will find another way," she said, "because that is what people who love each other do. They find another way. It might look different than this. It might be harder. But it would still be love. And love doesn't stop because circumstances change." Owen looked at his sketchbook. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Are you going to stay?" "After." The question landed in her chest with the precise weight of everything it was. She looked at the boy across the table from her, the boy who moved carefully through rooms, who taught himself knots and drew people at fence rails, and ate his dinner in the corner chair where he could see the door, who had shifted 3 inches on a fence rail one afternoon, and changed, without either of them noting it, everything. "I want to," she said. "That's the most honest answer I can give you." Owen nodded. He looked at the sketchbook again. Then he turned it so she could see the page. It was a drawing of the kitchen, this kitchen, with the lamp on the table, and the window behind it, and the stove against the wall. At the table sat 2 figures, one small and one adult, and the detail in the drawing was more careful than anything she had seen from him before. She could see the cup in the adult figure's hand. She could see the blanket on the small figure's shoulders. She could see, in the window behind them, the dark of the night outside, and in that darkness, very faintly, suggested rather than drawn, the shape of the ranch, the fence line, the barn, the land running out past the reach of the lamplight to wherever land goes when no one is watching it. She looked at it for a long time. "It's good," she said, because it was, and because sometimes the truest response to something beautiful is simply to name it. Owen pulled the sketchbook back toward him. He closed it and set it on the table beside him and drank from the warm cup she had put in front of him. And they sat in the kitchen together in the quiet of the house, 2 people waiting for the same outcome, which was itself a kind of belonging. Not the grand declared version, but the ordinary persistent one. The kind built from midnights and warm drinks and the particular courage of a child who had decided to ask a real question, and the particular courage of a woman who had decided to answer it honestly. She thought about all the nights she had sat alone in rooms that did not belong to her, in the years between leaving one life and arriving at this one. She had been good at being alone. She had cultivated it into something functional, even something she had told herself she preferred. But sitting across from Owen in the lamplight, with the dark pressing against the windows and the ranch asleep around them, she understood that what she had called preference had been, more honestly, a long practice in not wanting what she could not have. Later, after she had seen him back upstairs and the house had settled fully into its nighttime self, Wren sat at the kitchen table alone and opened the blue notebook. She sat with the pen in her hand for a long time without writing. Then she wrote, "He showed me the drawing. I think that means something I do not have words for yet." She looked at the sentence, added, "I intend to stay long enough to find the words." She closed the notebook and put out the lamp and went back upstairs in the dark, one hand light on the wall, learning the house by feel the way she had been learning everything here. Slowly, carefully, with the full attention of someone who understands that the things most worth knowing cannot be rushed. In his room at the end of the hall, Cole would be asleep or not asleep, holding his wife's letter in the careful way he held all the things that mattered. And in the morning, he would be at the window with his coffee before the sky decided on its color, and the ranch would wake around him the way it always did. And somewhere in the days ahead, a magistrate would write a decision on a piece of paper, and whatever it said, the people inside this house would face it, together. Not because an arrangement required it, but because they had, each of them, chosen it, quietly, incrementally, without announcement, in the accumulated language of small things that turned out not to be small at all. The dark held the house house held them. And Wren Calloway went to sleep with the ring in her pocket, and the notebook beside her lamp, and the particular piece of someone who has stopped running and started, at last, to arrive. The ruling arrived on the 7th day, as promised, in the form of a sealed document delivered by a rider who came at mid-morning while Wren was hanging laundry and Cole was somewhere in the south pasture, and Owen was at the kitchen table with his sketchbook. Ruth took it at the door and set it on the table beside the lamp without opening it, which was the only appropriate thing to do, and then went about her work with the studied deliberateness of a woman who understood that some moments required witnesses and some required only patience. Owen looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. He went back to drawing. When Cole came in an hour later, he saw it immediately. His eyes went to it the way eyes go to things they have been anticipating. The involuntary attention of someone who has been waiting long enough that the object of waiting has acquired a kind of gravity. He stood in the doorway for a moment, still in his coat, and looked at it. Then he looked at Owen. Then he looked at Wren, who had come in from the yard and was standing with the empty laundry basket at her side. He crossed the room and picked it up and held it without opening it, and she understood what he was waiting for. And she set the basket down and came to the table, and Owen set his pencil down and folded his hands, and Ruth appeared in the doorway from the hall, and Cole broke the seal. He read it standing up, which was how he did most things that mattered, on his feet, ready. His expression did not change as he read, which told her nothing, because his expression rarely changed in the ways that most people's did, and she had learned to read him in other registers. She watched his shoulders. She watched his hands. She watched the line of his jaw and the particular stillness that came over him when he was processing something of weight. When he lowered the paper, he looked at Owen first. "We're staying," he said. The words were plain and direct in the way all his words were plain and direct, and they landed in the room with a weight that was out of proportion to their simplicity, because they were not simple at all. They were the accumulated result of everything that had led to this morning, every careful day, every evening in the kitchen, every conversation on the porch in the cold, every small choice made by each of them to remain. Owen got up from his chair and crossed the room and pressed himself against his father's side without ceremony, without drama, the way children hold on when they are too relieved for words and too old to pretend otherwise. Cole put his arm around the boy and held him there, and he looked at Wren over Owen's head, and his expression in that moment was the most unguarded she had ever seen from him. Not just the face beneath the face, but the thing beneath that, the part a person almost never shows because showing it requires a certainty of welcome that is very difficult to come by. She held his gaze and did not look away. Ruth made a sound in the doorway that might, in a woman of less self-possession, have been a sniff. She disappeared in the direction of the kitchen, and shortly afterward the smell of coffee began to move through the house, which was Ruth's language for celebration. The ruling had noted, among its formal provisions, that the existing domestic arrangement demonstrated sufficient stability and genuine investment in the child's welfare to satisfy the requirements of the proceeding. It had noted, in the careful language of such documents, that the relationship between Mr. Hargrove and Miss Calloway, while begun under particular circumstances, appeared to reflect genuine mutual commitment rather than strategic convenience. Wren read this line twice when Cole passed her the paper. She read it twice because the first time she read it, she was not sure she had understood it correctly, and the second time she read it, she was sure. And she set the paper back on the table and looked at the window and the cold, clear morning beyond it. Outside, the grass ran out to where the land changed color on the horizon, which she had never been able to see clearly from any window until this one. It was James Whitmore who came that afternoon. He came alone, without Aldred, without the apparatus of the proceeding, and he tied his horse at the post and stood in the yard for a moment before Cole opened the door. They looked at each other. Two men who had been on opposite sides of something and were now standing in the aftermath of it, which required a different kind of reckoning than opposition. Wren watched from the kitchen window as they stood in the yard for a moment before Cole stepped aside. There was something in the way they faced each other that was neither hostile nor warm. The careful posture of two people who have each caused the other difficulty and are deciding, without discussion, whether to treat that as a reason for resentment or as the necessary cost of caring about the same thing. She thought that this was the more honest version of most human conflicts. Not malice facing malice, but love facing love across a disagreement about what love required. Cole stepped aside and let him in. Wren was in the kitchen. She heard the low exchange of voices in the front room and stayed where she was, understanding without being told that this conversation needed to happen without her in it, at least at first. She kept her hands occupied with the work in front of her and listened to the rhythm of the voices without trying to make out the words. After a while it was quiet, and then Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway. "He'd like to speak with you," he said, "if you're willing." She dried her hands and went to the front room. James Whitmore was standing near the window, the same window through which, weeks ago, she had watched Cole standing in the yard in the dark. He turned when she came in. His face held the sorrow she had seen in the hearing room, but it was different now, less defended, the sorrow of a man who has reached the end of a particular effort and is looking at what it cost. He said, "I owe you an apology." She waited. "I knew about Ashby," he said. "Not everything, but enough." He represented himself as someone acting in Owen's interest, and I allowed myself to believe that because I wanted resources I didn't have on my own, and because I was grief, and grief makes people want to act, even when the action is wrong. He looked at her directly. "I used your history as a weapon without knowing your story. Those are not the same thing, and I knew the difference, and chose not to observe it." Wren considered him. The genuine quality of his accounting, the absence of justification, the particular difficulty of a man admitting to having been both wrong and sincere simultaneously. "Owen came to see you," she said. It was not a question. Whitmore's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but something more complicated. The look of a man who has been moved by something he had not anticipated, and is still carrying the weight of it. 4 days ago, he said, before the ruling, he walked to my house alone. I don't believe his father knew. He paused. He stood in my doorway, and he said, Whitmore stopped, started again, more carefully. He said he knew I wanted what was good for him. He said he believed that. And then he said that what was good for him was staying with his father, and that the woman his father had brought to Broken Spur was not pretending to care about either of them. He looked at Wren directly. He said, She doesn't smile at me the way people do when they want me to like them. She just stays. The kitchen was quiet around them. Wren looked at the window. Outside, somewhere on the property, Owen was doing whatever Owen did in the afternoons, drawing or working with rope, or simply moving through the land he had grown up on and intended to continue growing up on. He's 9 years old, she said, not quite to Whitmore and not quite to herself. He is, Whitmore said, and he's his mother's son. Whitmore looked at the window and then back at her. My sister would have wanted him to be happy here. I think I understood that before I was willing to admit it. He looked at Wren with the eyes of someone making a final assessment, not hostile now, simply careful. She also would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for people who were not honest about what they wanted. Wren felt the echo of Cole's words from an earlier evening. She would have found you interesting. She thought that the woman who had left a letter for her husband to open when he was ready had been, in life, someone worth knowing. Thank you for coming, she said. That mattered. He nodded once, the way the men of this country nodded when they meant something and had no more words for it. And she thought that perhaps this quality was not so much a regional habit as simply a human one. The gesture that meant I have said what is true, and I trust you to receive it. He left before supper. She watched his horse move down the road from the kitchen window, growing smaller against the gray gold of the late afternoon, until it reached the point where the road bent and disappeared. That evening, the 60 days ended, not with announcement, not with ceremony. The day simply concluded in the way days conclude, the light going, the cold settling, the house drawing in around its occupants, the way houses do when the dark comes. Owen ate his supper and showed his father a drawing and went upstairs. Ruth moved through her end-of-day tasks with the quiet authority she brought to everything and retired to her room. The kitchen lamp burned low. Cole found Wren on the porch. She was standing at the railing with her arms folded against the cold, looking out at the dark shape of the land under the clear night sky. The stars were very bright. They were always very bright here, she had learned. This was one of the things about the place that had accumulated in her, one of the details she had recorded in the notebook, not because she needed to remember it, but because writing it down was a way of holding it carefully. She heard the door. She heard him come to stand beside her, not quite touching, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold. They stood that way for a while without speaking, which was not unusual for them. But the silence tonight had a different texture. Expectant without being pressured, the quiet of something approaching rather than something waiting to be endured. The cold was clean and direct, the kind of cold that clarified rather than numbed, and beneath it the ranch breathed its nighttime sounds. The distant shift of horses, the creak of the old barn settling, the wind moving through the grass of the eastern pasture in the long, unhurried waves she had learned to fall asleep to. She had not expected to love the sounds of this place. She had not expected to love this place at all, had come to it with nothing more than the decision that it was better than where she was leaving. But love, she had learned, did not always arrive as a decision. Sometimes it arrived as a slow accumulation of specific knowledge. The creak of the third floorboard, the way the kitchen smelled before daylight, the particular silence of a man who was listening carefully rather than simply not speaking. Sometimes love arrived as the moment you realized you had stopped noticing you were somewhere new. 60 days, Cole said. Yes. You didn't go. She looked at him. He was looking out at the dark, his profile against the stars, the face she had learned over these weeks in all its variations, the closed version and the open one, and all the gradations between. You didn't ask me to stay, she said. He turned then. He looked at her with the full, unguarded expression, the one that cost him something every time, and that he gave anyway now, with a steadiness that had grown over the weeks from tentative to certain. He said, "Stay. Not for Owen, not for the proceeding, or the ruling, or any of what has already happened." He paused, and she could see him choosing the words with the care he brought to all necessary things. "Stay because I want you here. Because this house is different with you in it. Because I have spent 3 years learning how to be alone. And I find I do not want to continue the education." A pause. "Because when I read my wife's letter, the part about standing beside someone, you were the only person I could see in it." The night was very quiet. Below them, the dark land ran out to the line where it met the sky. And somewhere in the distance a horse moved in the pasture, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch at rest surrounded them. She reached into her coat pocket and closed her hand around her sister's ring. She thought about a girl who had died without ever having chosen a single thing about the shape of her own life. She thought about the notebook and all the pages filled with the evidence that she had been present, had paid attention, had taken the measure of what was real. She thought about the key on the dresser and the coffee on the counter and a boy shifting 3 inches on a fence rail and a man reading a letter in lamplight with his hands not quite steady. She took the ring out of her pocket and looked at it in the dark. The small, plain circle of silver, worn smooth. "She never got to choose," Wren said. "My sister. She never had the chance to stand somewhere and say, 'This is what I want. This is where I am staying.'" She closed her fingers around the ring. "I am choosing this." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he extended his hand, palm up, and she looked at it. The rough, familiar hand, the calluses, the evidence of years of work. And she placed her hand in his, not the ring, her hand, and he closed his fingers around it in the unhurried way he did everything that mattered. And that was how it was. No pronouncement, no ceremony, just the porch and the cold and the stars, and 2 people who had arrived at the same place by different roads and had decided, without requiring anything further of each other, to remain. The next morning, Owen came downstairs and found them both in the kitchen, Cole at the window with his coffee, Wren at the stove, the ordinary morning assembling itself around them the way mornings do when they have been doing this long enough to have a shape. Owen sat at the table in his corner chair. He looked at his father. He looked at Wren. He looked back at his father. He said nothing. He pulled his sketchbook toward him and opened it to a new page and began to draw. Later that morning, he left the sketchbook open on the table when he went outside. Deliberately open, she understood. The page turned to a drawing he had made that she had not yet seen. She came to the table and looked at it. It was the view from the kitchen window. The pasture, the fence line, the land running out toward the hills, the sky enormous above all of it. In the foreground, the windowsill, and on the sill, a small object she recognized after a moment as a ring. A plain circle, carefully rendered, catching a light the drawing could only suggest. She stood at the table for a long time, looking at it. The drawing was precise in the way Owen's drawings had become over these weeks. Not technically accomplished in the way of formal training, but attentive in a way that was rarer and more difficult to learn. The attentiveness of someone who looks at things because he genuinely wants to understand them. He had drawn the ring on the sill with the same care he had drawn the horses at the fence and the figures in the kitchen and the knots at the fence rail. As though it mattered, as though the record of it was itself a form of keeping. She thought about all the things that Boy had taught himself to keep in his drawings because he had not yet found another way to hold them. Then she went to the window and looked out at the actual view, the pasture, the fence line, the land, the sky. And she felt the house around her and the morning in it, and the particular quality of a place that has been lived in by people who loved each other and is now, still, being lived in by people who are learning how. She reached for the blue notebook. She opened it to the last written page. She turned back through it briefly, not reading, just feeling the accumulated weight of all the pages that had come before. All the observations and plans and questions that had been her companion through these weeks. The record of a person paying attention to the world she was moving through. The early pages were careful and guarded, the handwriting slightly more formal than it became later, the observations precise in the way of someone writing for the record rather than for herself. But as the pages progressed, something changed. The handwriting loosened, the entries grew longer and less structured, the observations became more personal, less like evidence and more like letters to herself about what she was discovering. She did not need to read them. She knew what they said. She knew the trajectory of them. From the woman who had arrived with a key in her pocket and a careful plan, to the woman standing at this window looking out at land she had come to know. The way you know a place, you have decided to stay. Below the final line she had written, "I intend to stay long enough to find the words." She wrote one more. "I am staying." She closed the notebook. She set it on the windowsill beside the lamp, where the morning light fell across its blue cover, and she went back to the stove, and the kitchen held them all. And outside, the land ran out to where the color changed on the horizon, and the day was just beginning. She thought, briefly and without sentiment, about the woman she had been on the morning she had walked out of her family's house with a trunk and a bag and her sister's ring in her pocket. That woman had been brave in the way that people are brave when they have run out of other options. Not the chosen courage of someone who could have remained and decided instead to move, but the necessary courage of someone for whom remaining had become impossible. She did not diminish that. It had brought her here. But the courage she felt now, standing at the window of a kitchen that was hers in the way that only a place you have decided to keep can be yours, was different. It was the courage of staying, of choosing, every morning, the same people and the same ground, of understanding that this ordinary, particular, imperfect life was not a consolation, but a destination.